To give you an idea of what's happening in Nigeria right now, one of the key groups here went off on their own because they were too extreme for Islamic State. Let that sink in. Now, we're talking about executions and slavery, and according to President Trump, the deliberate targeting and killing of Christians, something that prompted the president just last week to threaten sending in our military if the situation wasn't resolved. So I thought it would be worth digging into the security situation in Nigeria to better understand what exactly is going on, the history of the conflict, and key players involved today. So to help with that, we're talking with Jacob Zenn. Jacob is an analyst focused on the extremist groups in this area, like Islamic State, West African Province, and more. You can follow his work on X as well as his website, Unmasking Boko Haram, both of which will be linked in the description below. And with that, let's get to the conversation. All right, Jacob, thank you so much for taking the time, man. You are really focused and an expert in some of these areas that are getting a lot more news recently. So I'm sure you're probably, your phone's ringing off the hook, email blowing up with people asking these questions. It means a lot that you would take a little bit of time here with us today.
Absolutely happy to discuss these issues with you and share some ideas with your audience.
So let's start with Nigeria, if we can. Just, I think it was last week or the week prior, President Trump talked about there's Christians being persecuted there. And if Nigeria doesn't, just the kind of general gist of it, if Nigeria doesn't step up, then we're going to intervene. I think a lot of people were caught off guard by that, probably not hearing much about Nigeria at all. Can you give us a little background as like what's going on there?
Absolutely. In fact, Trump made this statement around a week ago, basically to the effect, as you mentioned, of Nigeria is not doing enough, or even that Nigeria is allowing the genocide of Christians in Nigeria, and that if something wasn't done about it soon, then the U.S. military could get involved, or the U.S. government was going to start paying more attention to this. This caught people off guard, especially in Nigeria, because the violence in that region of the world, particularly northeastern Nigeria, has been going on for about 15 years. And right now, there's nothing particularly exceptional going on that is different than what we've seen over the past year. So they were wondering, what just happened to make Trump make the statement? And I think a lot of Nigerians were taken aback by it as well, because the Nigerian government has made some positive strides towards combating Boko Haram in terms of somewhat greater accountability, in terms of somewhat improving the human rights record, and in somewhat containing the group. But yet this was an indication that Donald Trump was not pleased at all with Nigeria's progress. Now, to get to your question, Boko Haram, as we know it, has two main factions. One is called Islamic State in West Africa Province, or ISWAP. The other is an Arabic name, Jamaat Ahl Sunnah li Dawati wal Jihad, meaning the Sunni group for preaching and jihad. And that group is commonly referred to as JAST nowadays. But anyway, these two factions are fighting each other a lot, actually. One is aligned to ISIS. One wants to be aligned to ISIS, but ISIS rejects them for being too extreme. ISWAP, namely, is aligned with ISIS. And they've been killing each other over the past week.
ISIS said they were too extreme?
Yeah.
ISIS said they were too extreme? I feel like
Exactly.
Usually it's the other way around.
I know. The JAST faction, which used to be led by Abu Bakr Shekau, who was one of the most mercurial jihadist leaders one could imagine. I have a bunch of videos of him on my website, unmaskingbokoharam.com. He did certain things that ISIS didn't even like. For example, he took slaves that were Christian, but also that were Muslim, because the Muslims, he said, were not Muslim simply because those girls went to Western or secular school. And ISIS said, you're going a little bit too far. And Shekau also went to an extreme degree, Shekau being the former leader of JAST faction, where he said any Muslim who doesn't join our group is an infidel and we will kill them. So that's a very wide array of people to be killed. And even for ISIS, that was really stretching it. And he just did wild mannerisms in videos, like jumping around in circles, shooting a gun in the air, making like groans and chants and scratching his crotch. Very strange figure. So ISIS had originally accepted him into the group, and then actually kicked him out. And then they named a different leader as the leader, who was a little more balanced. And so now Shekau actually had to be kicked out of ISWAP at that time in 2016 to form his own faction, JAST. And now ISWAP has continued with the alliance to ISIS. In fact, Shekau was killed. This very extreme leader was killed in 2021 in a raid by ISWAP. He killed himself rather than have ISWAP capture him. And Shekau's progeny are still leading his faction, and they're actually fighting with ISWAP in some of the most intense battles of the past years in Lake Chad. They're fighting in canoes, shooting each other. One of the latest videos to come out of this interfactional strife literally had a canoe filled with blood, literally, because so many actually ISWAP members were killed. So these factions are actually killing each other to a large degree. But to get to Trump's point, a lot of people are getting killed. I guess the point about the genocide against Christians, and I know we're touching on a lot of bases here, is that only Christians really have the potential to be genocided in northeastern Nigeria by Boko Haram because they're a minority. So it is in fact possible to completely kill them all or expel them all. Whereas there are so many Muslims that Boko Haram is fighting that it's not realistic that they will, for example, kill them all. So that's sort of the power dynamic there.
Did I understand correctly that both of those groups fall under Boko Haram right now?
Yeah, they're both called Boko Haram by the media and by the government and under that moniker, but neither group uses that name. As I mentioned, one group calls itself Islamic State in West Africa Province. The other group calls itself Jamaat al-Taslim Lidawati wal Jihad, or JAST. So Boko Haram is actually just a moniker used originally by Muslim preacher enemies of the group. It means Western education is sinful. And so the religious enemies of the group, or the mainstream Muslims as they were then called them Boko Haram, just to be like, these are the stupid guys who say that Western education is sinful, and we'll just call them all Boko Haram. But the group has never liked that name, and this will not surprise you, but they have threatened multiple times to kill anyone who calls them by that name.
So they really don't like the name. Okay, got it. That's interesting because I feel like Boko Haram is still used pretty widely in Western media.
Absolutely. It's used widely in Western media and by governments, but by analysts who are focusing more sharply on the group, we use the two factional names because there are differences in the ideologies, area of operations, tactics, and leadership of the two factions. So from an analytical perspective, when you're talking about Boko Haram, you usually need to say, are you talking about ISWAP or JAST, let alone a third faction that evolved from the Boko Haram milieu, which is called Ansar al-Muslimin fi Bilad Sudan, which means supporters of Muslims in Black Africa, also called Ansaru. And this is an Al-Qaeda affiliated faction. Which both of those other factions are killing, so they had to run away to the northwest of the country. So it's really a complex situation with three main factions, all called Boko Haram, but none of which actually call themselves Boko Haram.
Now, would it be safe to assume that the Christians that are being killed are caught in the middle of that fighting, or are they being specifically targeted? What does that look like?
I think it's safe to say that the Christians are uniquely targeted for being Christian. That in itself leaves them vulnerable to both factions. And in particular, the JAST faction of the late Abu Bakr Shekau, they were specifically targeted for enslavement. As I mentioned, it's not exclusive to Christians. Some Muslim girls were also enslaved. But I do feel like the violence was tailored towards Christians in a unique way. And although, again, it's not unique to Christians, their villages have been raided and plundered. They have often been captured and featured in propaganda videos by the factions wearing Guantanamo-style jumpsuits, being executed by being shot in the head, like in a lineup. So they've really been targeted in a terrible way. But it's important to note that these Christian communities in northeastern Nigeria, particularly in the mountains between Nigeria and Cameroon, they're indigenous to that region. They've been there for ages, and they're really not leaving. So it's really an impressive story of resilience amid all the pressure that they're facing. So some of the pushback against the genocide narrative against Christians is that Muslims are also being killed, and that's true. I just think, as I mentioned before, what's unique about the Christian cases, they could actually be genocided. They could actually be exterminated and eliminated if they're not protected enough. Where Muslims, there's no capability to probably kill them all, even though the intent by these factions is to kill both all Christians as well as all Muslims who oppose their jihad.
Yeah, it feels like the Christian piece came in here, and we don't want to play the game of like there's more or less killed from one religious group or another, or like specifically targeted definitely raises the ante a little bit, but there's a ton, to your point, there's a ton of innocent people being killed constantly by these groups. So I really try to avoid like a comparison almost, if that makes sense. But it does seem like the Christian aspect, that's what the Trump administration keyed in on. And when you see the people that appear to be influencing him inside or outside of government, that's the aspect they keyed in on. So that's why the attention right now has shifted to Nigeria, is kind of how I'm viewing it. Do you think that's generally accurate?
That's possible. There's likely something underlying the reason why President Trump recently focused on Christians. And I don't want to go so far and to make speculations because I'm not involved in those discussions. But there could be all types of theories, like maybe the military is looking around the world for places to become more involved and use their assets in the future, given the struggles Nigeria is having with the Boko Haram factions. They're thinking about getting more involved in the Sahel in Nigeria. Sort of the Christian aspect is an angle, which is not necessarily untrue that the Christians are not being targeted, but it's sort of being used as like a pin to be used to get into the region, sort of like an excuse or a reason. But it is possible there's also some intelligence that people have, because the Sahel region is utterly in disarray and crisis, right to the north of Nigeria. Nigeria's northern region is obviously in a lot of trouble. So I could see some very astute intelligence observers in the U.S. being like, the Sahel Nigeria region is falling in a downward spiral. The only real international actor that's involved there now is Russia, which could concern the U.S. in a number of ways. France has largely been booted out of that region. The U.S. as well, by these pro-Russian juntas in the Sahel. So, and I mean, the Sahel countries are really being overrun by the Al-Qaeda affiliate, and to a lesser extent, the ISIS affiliate there. So the U.S. might be saying, we actually have to get involved. The situation's getting too dangerous. But to sell it to a local audience in the U.S. as, a place in Africa is insecure, might not work. So you might need to pull in something that'll resonate more with Americans, like a Christian angle, to justify a further military presence. Possible.
Yeah, that was very well stated. You're not going to speculate. I'll speculate here for a minute. If we are trying to sell intervention in Africa, I think clearly talking about Christians did the trick, because it's actually getting attention here. And this is happening at the same time as the Al Fashir massacres, quite frankly, in Sudan, that are looking to be some of the most graphic, highest casualty. Just genocide is the conversation being thrown around, and that is not making it into the American conversation like Nigeria is right now. So that Christian, that little piece of saying Christians definitely, if it was the purpose, definitely did the trick. But a question I have for you is, we're talking about these extremist groups, Islamic State affiliated. But what about the government? Because there were some indications in Trump's statement, like you suggested, that they either weren't doing enough or at times maybe even facilitating. We haven't talked about the government forces at all. Where do they fit in here?
Right. And so I think when the headline is Christians at risk of genocide in Nigeria, usually one thinks that, a government is doing it, and therefore the Nigerian government is responsible for it. But in fact, the Nigerian government is not trying to genocide Christians, and it's Boko Haram who's trying to do it, if anyone's trying to do it, and the Nigerian government is simply not able to stop Boko Haram to an extent to prevent it, or not doing enough. But I do think it is important to say that originally it is definitely true that the Nigerian government overlooked the Boko Haram crisis. They shoved it to the side, disregarded it, were overconfident about defeating the group. And they would say things like, this group will be defeated soon. Our timeline's 3 years. And that obviously didn't happen. But now the rhetoric from the leadership of Nigeria, from everything I see, is much more realistic. Like, this is a serious problem. It's not going away soon. We recognize the extent of the problem, and we really need to clean up our act and improve to combat the group. The problem is the group has grown to such an extent that it's not an easy task. And having the right attitude now, albeit too late, is not enough to defeat the group. But I actually think one thing that's underappreciated in Nigeria is that from the Muslim community of Nigeria, or say the leading Salafi or Islamic preachers, I do think when Boko Haram started, they also didn't appreciate the extent of the ideology of Boko Haram's resonance or its ability to recruit. And some of them maybe even played along with similar narratives to Boko Haram about the Crusader West, attacking Nigeria or Muslims, and that was counterproductive. But today, I actually think the power of Boko Haram has shown the leadership of the Muslims in Nigeria the importance of distancing themselves from Boko Haram, combating the ideology of Boko Haram. And I actually think now the Muslim leaders of Nigeria have a much more respectable position towards interreligious relations and harmony and combating the ideology of Boko Haram that they did. So it would also be unfair, particularly in this case, to pin the possible genocide of Nigerians on even the Muslim leadership in Nigeria. It's really a Boko Haram thing.
What's driving their recruiting? You mentioned that everybody kind of was caught off guard to a degree of how fast they grew or how powerful they become. What's driving that?
So originally, you could attribute the recruitment to a few factors. For one, the Nigerian government had these massacres of the followers of the original leader of the movement called Muhammad Yusuf, who basically preached for an Islamic state and Sharia, and that Muslims were under attack by the West. And the Nigerian government, on more than one occasion, tried to eliminate his following by just killing them all, including the original leader, Muhammad Yusuf, whose successor became the more extreme Shekau. So that was obviously counterproductive, because when you killed all these members and family members and friends, and when you have families of 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10, then you're getting, a lot of recruits to sprout up after that. Um, and but actually now I think the situation is more complex than the group's ideology being attractive or people fighting because they're angry at the government's overreach. Now the group has really like so many members and so much territory that I think they're largely able to recruit from just within their own children and within their own families and within the communities around them. Because they already have several thousand fighters. These fighters generally get married. As I mentioned before, some of them capture slaves and that sort of things and have children with them. And sometimes the women end up staying with them because now they're stuck in the camps and have children. But there's so many like youths in the ranks of these factions, from both the fighters' children as well as those who are just living in the territories that they've captured, that I don't even think they need an attractive ideology where they need to go around the country trying to recruit people to get members. It's really coming within their own villages, and it's probably enough to sustain their tens of thousands of fighters at this point, which I think is really problematic, because the main idea of counter-violent extremism and these counter-ideological programs is to build resilience in the society against these groups' ideology. And I think Nigeria's actually done a pretty good job of that. But the problem is coming from within the territories of the group itself, where you really can't conduct those initiatives, and the group has an automatic ideological indoctrination session into children being raised in the group.
Well, I do want to shift over to some questions about Sudan before too long here, but I'm going to take this question any direction you want. I'm a little bit jaded because I feel like we've got all of these Islamic State branches popping up around the world over the last 10, 15, 20 years, almost 20 years, 10, 15 years. And it's like we're not defeating them. We don't have it seems like we don't have the right solution. So when I hear of a group like this and the U.S. is talking about maybe we'll send in, who knows? Again, I'll leave this one open to you. Who knows what the support package would look like, or boots on the ground or not, or local alliances. Can these groups be defeated with the right resources, and what would those resources look like?
I have a little bit more of an optimistic perspective, because over
Love
the past,
all right, good.
Yeah, over the past 10 to 15 years, at least let's just start in Africa, we have seen a lot of African ISIS branches pop up in Algeria, Libya, Sinai, Egypt, for example. And they actually have been defeated largely through a combination of military, intelligence-led operations, and strong governments. Not necessarily accountable governments, but we have seen really a reduction in ISIS in like Northern Africa, for example. And even if we look around the world, Southeast Asia, where I think actually good governance has been a more prominent factor in making people not join ISIS, we have seen ISIS reduced in the Philippines and Indonesia as well. So we actually have made some progress. And even in Syria, for example, it's an impressive case where ISIS is certainly on the back foot, or not as strong as it was. But the pessimistic point, yeah, is in sub-Saharan Africa, ISIS is extremely strong. It's just like it was 10 years ago. The outfits they wear, the propaganda, it's almost as if, we're still in the year 2015 when it comes to Nigeria. And I think, unfortunately, from a policy perspective, if you really want to go on a military solution to defeat ISWAP, the Nigerian ISIS branch, you need a real full 100% effort, like when ISIS was combated in Syria around 2019. That military effort was massive, comprehensive, and really led to putting the hammer on ISIS. I think something like that could put a dent on ISWAP in Nigeria, but that's a full comprehensive effort that would need the full backing of the U.S. military and probably Western powers and Nigeria. A lot of people would oppose it because they think it would be counterproductive because maybe the group would leverage it for propaganda to recruit. But I do think that there could be some military solution like that. I don't know if the U.S. has the will to do that. So aside from that, I see a lot of like minor steps towards combating the group militarily in northeastern Nigeria, and I don't think that will be enough to defeat the group militarily. And as mentioned, they control enough territory that they keep recruiting and growing. And I actually think in the long term, this sort of stalemate between the Nigerian government and ISIS in Nigeria is probably in ISIS's favor because they just sort of grow. But yeah, I would say that there have been some successes of ISIS around the world. And obviously some not successes, failures, which is probably Nigeria's case. But it's also important to point out, getting to what you're saying about like al-Fashir and these other parts of the world. Sometimes you defeat ISIS, but you leave yourself with other complicated problems in its wake. You might be an excessively authoritarian government, or it might cause a great humanitarian catastrophe to defeat ISIS. So there are these sort of costs and benefits in a way of defeating ISIS. And even in places where ISIS doesn't exist, like Sudan, where it's very minimal presence, you have all types of other problems often, such as like these interfactional fighting between army battalions, essentially, like the RSF and the SAF in Sudan. So ISIS isn't the only security issue in the world, even if it gets the most attention.
It sounds like, yes, definitely headlines for ISIS, right? We all understand that, or more people understand that than if you say RSF in Sudan, then it's what the hell does that stand for, and who is that? And is there any connection there between Sudan and Nigeria? It does seem like, from an outsider looking in, that these Islamic State branches in Africa tend to transcend borders more than maybe in other parts of the world. What does that look like there?
Yeah, historically, actually, Sudan and Nigeria have a lot of kinship relations, especially because the far northeast part of Nigeria, believe it or not, is closer to the Sudanese border than to Lagos in the southwest of Nigeria. These countries, like on the map, Nigeria looks like the west, Sudan looks like the east, but they're actually not that far. They share a sort of Central African, historical boundary. And a lot of Nigerians that previously went to Saudi Arabia for Hajj, from the medieval times, would get like stuck in Sudan on the way, and so you have a lot of Nigerian families with ties to Sudan and whatnot. And actually, when ISIS was strong throughout northern Africa before, it wasn't uncommon for the ISIS group in Nigeria to recruit Sudanese. These days, it's much harder because there is better intelligence around ISIS in Africa, so they can't really go to Somalia as easily or communicate with the Somalis or with other factions in the Sahel as easily as before. Um, but there's often some security trend lines that will overlap throughout the region. I think perhaps one of the more important things in the Sudan case is this sort of geopolitics and proxies, and you have the hands of some regional or international actors supporting the different RSF or SAF factions. And that to me relates a little bit more to the Sahel region, where now Russia is the big player. In fact, Russia is perhaps, it's definitely the predominant player in the Sahel now, for better or worse. But you have a lot of geopolitical interests in Sudan, East Africa, as well as in West Africa. And this also brings into the discussion of rare earths and minerals and gold mines. And there's an interplay between these proxies, geopolitical actors, insurgents, and governments, corrupt or not.
Did I see correctly that one of these Islamic State groups spoke or issued a statement kind of following Trump's threat? Did I see that?
That was interesting. It was, in fact, in the ISIS newsletter that they've been publishing weekly for years now. they reacted very quickly to Trump's message, and it made it pretty clear that if Trump is going to get the U.S. involved in Nigeria, ISIS is going to leverage it for its global affiliates to basically say the U.S. is attacking us, in this case in Nigeria, and this is another Crusader attack, and we need to rise up against it. So ISIS is definitely using it as fodder for its global recruitment campaign, and that's actually one of the reasons why ISIS in Nigeria, ISWAP in particular, is important to ISIS, because ISIS has been depleted in certain areas around the world, but it's so powerful in Nigeria that a large proportion of its propaganda these days is its operations in and around Nigeria. And so it still publicizes attacks on Christians in Nigeria, for example, to rally the global IS followership in a way that it can't, based on its minimal operations in Syria. And in this case, they're leveraging Trump's comments on Nigeria again to rally the global base. So Nigeria and the broader West Africa region still plays a crucial role for both for propaganda for ISIS globally.
So this feels like a double-edged sword where a lot of bad dudes. The world would be a better place without them. But the minute we start to get involved, they're going to leverage that thing to the hilt, right? Look, we're under attack. Come help us, or carry out attacks on our behalf.
Right, absolutely. And this is what I was talking about before too, with costs and benefits, and in particular second order effects. You could imagine a scenario where the U.S. does get involved militarily in Nigeria and is effective. It's possible. And ISWAP, this very bad faction, is reduced. But it's possible there will be second order effects that we can't exactly foresee, like it rallying the global base of ISIS elsewhere in the world, or other Islamist groups elsewhere in the world, or somehow favoring Russia in some way, which is, of course, an adversary of the U.S. So I think that's absolutely right, that this will definitely be used by ISIS as a propaganda.
Have we seen that much, though? I'm having a hard time thinking of an example where Islamic State was under attack, say ISKP in Afghanistan was getting bombed by the U.S., so another branch kind of attacked on their behalf. Have we seen that type of coordination from ISIS?
In terms of propaganda, we have seen some examples of them leveraging propaganda from one area of the world to support other areas. For example, when ISIS was controlling northern Libya around a decade ago, they would conduct mass executions, and that was supposed to be an example for other groups around the world to follow, including then Nigeria. You would then copy the way ISIS in Libya was doing things. Um, but you might be right that sometimes the effects of these propaganda efforts are hard to quantify, and maybe we overestimate them. But on another token, usually it seems like the propaganda that took place in Syria resonated more globally because it's a more historic or central Islamic place of the world. And actually, one of the problems that Al Qaeda and ISIS have had with a place like Nigeria is that although the group has conducted lots of attacks, which are great for propaganda, it's hard to really rally your global base around a country like Nigeria, which is a little bit far away. And like the propaganda from ISIS or Al Qaeda in the past about Nigeria has always been very generic, like in the jungles of Nigeria, dark-skinned men will wage jihad against the Crusaders. It's like they don't have a very good grasp of it. Whereas when they're talking about something more central to the Middle East or the core of where ISIS and Al Qaeda came from, they have like more direct or widespread narratives about like a Sham or Syria, Damascus, Jerusalem, and that sort of thing. So it might not resonate as much coming from Nigeria.
There were a ton of international fighters that went to Syria under Islamic State. Do you think that had anything to do with it? Like they had more international voices to be able to say, like, here's how to reach the French population? Or is that same dynamic in Nigeria?
Yeah, absolutely. The ISIS has attempted to bring foreign fighters to Nigeria, and even Abu Muhammad al-Nani, who is like the second rank in the group a decade ago, called for Muslims around the world to go to Nigeria and help ISIS in Nigeria or ISWAP. But they really haven't ever seen a massive flowing to Nigeria or even the Sahel of foreign fighters, nearly on the scale of what happened in Syria, which was completely unprecedented, with tens of thousands of people from Europe to Indonesia to the Philippines, China, all going to Syria. So you really haven't seen that mobilization to Africa. And also, it's a pretty difficult place to live and survive in these Lake Chad shorelines of Nigeria, Chad, Cameroon, where ISWAP operates, compared to what was called the five-star jihad of Syria, which wasn't necessarily luxury, but it was probably more luxury than you can get in the places where ISWAP operates. No
That's
swimming
saying
pool.
something. Good to know. So if you're listening and thinking about going over, don't. There's no swimming pool. Jacob, appreciate it, man. This is a lot to keep track of. Really grateful that you're doing it and you're staying on top of this and then taking the time to share with us today. So we'll put below where everybody can find you and follow your work, and please keep it up.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on. Glad to share these ideas with you and your audience.
So thank you again so much to Jacob for taking the time to walk through all of this. I'm always so impressed when people like Jacob are so laser focused on some of these subjects and just kind of have an incredibly detailed knowledge of everything that's been going on there for 10 years, right? So, of course, be sure to follow Jacob on X. His new website, Unmasking Boko Haram, is linked in the description below as well. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.